Well, it's 6:50 a.m. and I woke up 20 minutes ago. And I went to sleep at a more or less reasonable time. So, finally got like a full night's rest. That may have only been possible because I was like pacing in a circle for like most of the day yesterday. I was really exhausted by the end of the day. Pacing in a circle is something that I do when I think. I also do it when I'm having strong emotions that are so strong that I just can't sit still. So, there are various options there. You can go for a walk. But very often I feel like I can't walk exactly in the way I would want to walk because I would want to narrate things to myself as I walk. And people tend to give you strange glances when they do that. They don't enjoy hearing people talk to themselves. And even though, it's a big city and who gives a shit, no one's going to say shit to you for anything that you do, basically. I still feel the eyes on me, and I feel the discomfort of the people around me because they're wondering, is this guy a little off his rocker? He's not talking on a phone. He's talking very animatedly because I just kind of can't help it. So I tend to stay inside and pace around in a circle and talk to myself instead and not expose, my poor human beings to that energy. Not all the time. I mean, sometimes I just go do it because sometimes I just need to. And, it's always fine. But it's just that it's a slightly, what am I saying here? I just feel exposed in the world, I suppose. So I end up pacing in circles a lot indoors. And that's been true my whole life, pretty much. It's occurred to me recently that that motion is a kind of movement of worship. And in fact, people do this in a religious context. They circle around something in the center. I'm thinking here of really any number of traditions. This occurs, of course, in Islam. There's the big rotation around the cube in Mecca. I'm blanking at the moment what the name of that thing is, impossibly. Well, I'm sure I'll remind myself later and edit it in. Jung identified this pattern and called it circumambulation. And it relates to the mandala idea. And it probably does, in the end, relate to these astrological ideas about circles and cycles and sort of rotating, interlocking rings and so on. Now, see, this is a very interesting and subtle point, in my opinion. Because if we consider worship, sort of physical worship practices like that say maybe involve rotating around a center, and then we consider imagistic depictions of, well, Jung would say in the end of the psyche, what is a mandala a depiction of? It's also kind of a strange cosmos idea often. It's kind of arranged into tiers and levels, sort of circles of hell kind of concept, or circles of heaven, or so on. So we think about all that, and then we think about the zodiacal ideas, which are also somehow representing the psyche and are also circular. That's a lot of common structure. And I just often wonder what that is all about. Is the psyche, in some sense, a big rotating, sort of nested stack of interlocking rings? Well, it couldn't be like that physically, because the brain just doesn't resemble that at all. There's no rotating physical structures in the brain like that, It's rather this dense network. And there are various other kinds of strange structures in there, but there's nothing like that. It's not some big gyroscopic thing in the middle of your head, yet that's how the unconscious seems to think of itself. So I think it's a description of itself in a systems kind of way. I think it's describing interlocking levels of activity that synchronize in a cyclical way or something. Now, maybe that's all completely wrong, but I have the intuition that something like that is probably going on. It is depicting something that is probably literally structurally true about it. It's just doing it in a rather abstract way. It's not showing you anything about its literal anatomical structure, of course. Why would that even be useful? It's telling you something about its nature as a complex adaptive system, maybe. Yesterday, of course, my pacing was not motivated by a desire to worship, or out of a desire to think, which is usually what gets me in that mode. It's actually somewhat a challenge to sit still like this and record a video. I really want to be pacing around while I talk and think. Yesterday, of course, it was still emotional distress. And I'll probably do a lot of pacing today as well. I've always been a highly emotional person. Story I sometimes tell is I used to be really obsessed with Footloose, this movie starring Kevin Bacon, where I actually haven't seen that movie in a long time, and I haven't watched it post-sync, as they say. Mainly I remember a scene where Kevin Bacon smashes a bottle on, for some reason, he's really angry. I think maybe it's it can't be right. Is there a backhoe loader or some other kind of big heavy machinery in that scene or something? Maybe he was a construction worker or something. Was that his job? I have no idea. I really don't remember this movie. I just remember the basic kind of setup is that it was a town where you're not allowed to dance or listen to music or something. Maybe there's a religious layer to that or something. And then Kevin Bacon has to shake it all loose and liquefy the town basically with the liberating power of song and dance or something. It's kind of a silly movie, I guess, but something about it really captured me as a kid. It was one of those movies that I watched quite repetitively as a kid. I had several that I just watched on a loop, basically. Back to the Future was one of them. Footloose, for some reason, was another. But Footloose had this logo that opened. It was just the Paramount Pictures logo. And it was the one, where the stars kind of zoom in over the mountain and form their little Stargate motif. And I just could not watch that logo without crying. It's funny because the movie itself didn't affect me that way. I didn't find the story to be emotional. It was the image that made me cry. It was just that picture. So I would just weep right at the top of that movie as a 4 or 5 year old. I would just stir and cry at what I called the Tinky stars as they flew into the frame. And then that was it. I had spent my emotional budget on that movie. I didn't really care about the rest of it. I rarely even really, I don't think I paid that much attention to it, weirdly. I think I just loved the intro. So that was me, I was just a little kid that would just burst into tears because of a pretty picture, And then you get older and you encounter the gendered demands in the world, and you learn that boys aren't supposed to display that kind of emotion. And you learn the typical thing, you learn how to just masculinize your presentation and not take things seriously, do this thing, which has never really been my mode. It's just a mode I've adopted to facilitate smooth interactions with people that aren't comfortable hanging in a more liminal zone with me. So that's just one of those domains. I can't do that anymore in my life, and that just means letting my emotionality be more visible. Emotionality makes people uncomfortable because they suspect that it's going to lead to bad action, because it's very often and typically what happens in the world. People have a feeling and then they freak out and they do irrational things because of it, because feelings aren't rational, they're instinctual. And it took me a long time in my life to learn how to have strong emotions without thinking that they necessarily require any action. And so the pacing is partly a way to hold that. You have a feeling, it's so strong you can't sit still. And so in a sense it's demanding action. Something physical has to happen. And it used to be that I worked that out in a more athletic way. I would go for runs and so on. I can't really run anymore, sadly. But I can go on long walks. Again, that's good. And I can certainly pace in a circle. So I do that, and it relieves often the immediate emotional intensity, eventually. And then you can think about it a little bit. Now, that's only possible if you have the option to isolate. Something happens and it really upsets you, and it's possible to move away from that situation, if even only for like 20 minutes or something. Who knows? Maybe you're having a huge altercation with your domestic partner and you're just screaming at each other. You know? Maybe one of you needs to go into the bathroom and shut the door and say, I'm not coming out and don't talk to me for 20 fucking minutes, please. And hopefully your partner will respect that. And not kind of come banging on the door and so on. In a kind of Jack Nicholson like axe concept. Or just whatever the situation is, if you can insert a little bit of actual physical or just sort of like some kind of literal distance and take some time to process your feelings and come back in a more cool-headed way, potentially, that maybe is a good thing to do. But the problem, of course, is that life often isn't like that. Very often you're in the middle of a situation that requires an immediate response, and there is no possibility to just retreat, to take some, time to formulate a strategy. Life is not a turn-based game. It doesn't work that way. You've got to respond quickly to things as they happen. And so it seems to be that our society's solution to the problem of emotions, particularly as they exist in men who are physically powerful, so it's a particular problem because if men get emotional and fly off the handle, I think they can do a little bit more damage sometimes than women, just in a basic physical sense. There's a lot of testosterone, there's a lot of upper body strength that combines to mean a lot of aggressive energy that is effective in the world. And so because of that, I think we've just adopted the only thing we know how to do, largely, which is say, okay, we just repress this stuff. If you have a feeling, repress it. Because if you let yourself feel it, you might get so agitated that then there might be a confrontation. And we now live in a civilized world where we think it's not good to be kind of physically fighting each other all the time and so on. Of course, this system really barely works because repressing emotions doesn't really remove them. They're festering in the unconscious. And that starts certain dynamics in motion that then tend to get worse. And then when people do eventually snap, when a feeling reaches the surface, because there just is far too much pressure now in the underground, it has to rupture out somewhere. When it ruptures, it's going to be as if you were, pinching shut the end of a hose, but the water has still been flowing. Now there's going to be a big blast. So unfortunately, this mode encourages precisely the thing it thinks it's helping avoid. It's just that it does it in a time-delayed way. And it seems that human beings are very, very bad at thinking about kind of significantly time-delayed consequences. Because it's not like you repress it maybe for a few minutes and then it leads to something like that. It takes time to build up that kind of intense pressure. And so it can be the case that people repress emotional issues for months or years or even decades, and then when they pop, they pop. And so it's another area where we haven't figured out collectively, or largely even as individuals, like how to interface with the unconscious in a real-time, healthy way. Because, okay, maybe you have to have the feeling as it's happening and not repress it, and understand why it's happening and bring some consciousness to it. The issue is that very often there's far too much going on. There's thoughts, there's feelings, and then once the feelings get started, it becomes like harder to think clearly. How to hold space in the moment is the question. Now, I'm not sure exactly what the answer is to that. I can just say that I've gotten better at that over the years. And I've gotten a lot better at that recently. Part of it does have to do with some kind of basic sort of Zen style disassociation technique or something, which is different than a repressive technique. Now, disassociation is kind of a negative clinical term for us, but I don't really mean it that way. Maybe actually disidentification is the better thing to say. The idea is you can have a feeling without identifying with it. You can know that it's a feeling and treat it as something that's just kind of emerging in your experiential field. And you can say, oh, there's all that anger coming up. I feel it. I see it. But I know that it's something that's emerging from an animal layer of my cognition and of my being. And it's difficult to describe this because I think if you dismiss it and say, stupid feeling, that actually somehow agitates that whole system. It's as if you're rejecting the entire emotional system. And it's a somewhat autonomous thing, I think. And I think it will feel dejected or something, no matter the feeling. Intense anger, intense love, intense joy, intense sorrow. You say silly, silly feelings, go away. They're going to develop a kind of negative attitude towards you, maybe. And maybe ambush you with very strange and bad feelings at very inopportune times and so on. And then you'll have a kind of weird emotional anxiety disorder or something. And you'll have to develop weird strategies like I did and pace around in circles in order to discharge all this kind of energy. But the disidentification thing is very useful. I think that it's very difficult to differentiate it from a repressive style often. Because the difference is purely about an internal attitude and orientation. Oh, my iPhone storage is almost full. I've been recording too many videos. I should go back and delete some of the other ones. Guess I'll do that in a second. Now I feel like I need to wrap this up, which is a shame because this was an interesting, winding topic. Maybe I'll pause it and then delete some videos and then watch this again to remember what I was talking about and then pick it back up. Let's see if I can pull that off in a nice, easy, continuous cut for you guys. Okay, hopefully that worked. I actually went into recently deleted and actually deleted, the weird stuff that your iPhone keeps around for you when it does it. Why can't they just use the same trash metaphor that I'm used to from my computer? Why does it have to be this weird thing buried in a sub-album of an album of a, Slight tangent here, obviously, but, we were interrupted by the technology, so now I'm going to address the technology, I guess, and say, hey, iPhone, I'm not very impressed by you anymore. The things that you do well are excellent, but I really think your designers have lost the plot a little bit about what makes for good interface ideas and so on. So even at that just very most basic level, you're losing your shine a little bit. It would be good if things made more sense and were less kind of nested, mixed metaphor things that you require me to think of. I mean, look, overall, it's quite good. It's way better than anything I use on my desktop. Just in terms of like basic interface fluidity and things like that. I really can't get along with Adobe Premiere, which is sad because I use it like all day, every day, pretty much. But wow, you want to talk about software that asks its users to like navigate through a million strange sort of halfway spatial, halfway verbal metaphors that switch around all the time, and like it's very obvious that it was not designed as a holistic thing. It was pieced together in a very garbage way over a long period of time, and there's just a lot of garbage around in it now because of that. So, yeah, too bad for Premiere. Now, that could be itself, of course, a kind of psychological model, and I suppose actually does, in a way, wrap back around to this topic of emotions. So it is about a kind of garbage collection, and I would say that emotional experiences often exist in very meaningful sequences that demand some hermeneutics. They demand some interpretation from you. And if you're just repressing them, or if you're perhaps not repressing them, but still just not thinking about them, which is where you can get into, I think, slightly with this kind of Zen-mindedness. You're still kind of dismissing them in a funny roundabout way. Ultimately, I think a lot of these systems are because they're kind of like spiritual health systems. They're a lot about avoiding suffering often. And it's like, well, I don't want to suffer through this emotion. It's just too strong, so I'm going to sort of zen out with it, just let it flow through. Now, that's a survival technique. If an emotion is so strong that it's just, you can't do anything else, it's just pure hell, like, maybe you need a break from it. And so if you can meditate your way into a calmer state, that's a very good thing to do. And just in general, I would like to recommend meditation or some kind of grounding practice to anyone doing this kind of work. And by this kind of work, I simply mean alchemical, magical, depth psychological, shamanic work. Anything like that that's requiring you to, or maybe even just, we could just say art, but like real art that requires you to walk into your head in a deep way. I was saying in a previous video, it is a kind of athletics, so take care of yourself. And a way to do that is to pace yourself and to figure out how to relax fundamentally. That's what meditation is really good for. And it is just a kind of hack. It's, people say, oh, I can't meditate, but I think they're not approaching it correctly. Because the point is just to slow down your breathing. That's really the whole thing. Just sit, count your breaths, take these long, slow ones, And the breath is supplying oxygen to your brain. So it actually forces the brain into different wave states, I think, as your breathing slows down. In any case, it's just for sure that as your breathing slows, you will move into increasingly calm states. And I'm someone who has quite a lot of trouble falling asleep often, but when my meditative practice is solid, which it isn't really right now, I've been using it a little bit, but not as much as I ought to. But when it's really solid, I can meditate my way just straight into a nap. It's really nice. You just slow it down enough and then clock out. So I think that there's just an unfortunate thing here. It may be that you're activating precisely because you haven't developed those kinds of practices. And so you haven't been doing good garbage management, and situations have been festering in your mind that you've been ignoring. And they're probably things that, it's things that you know. Your brain knows something, either about you or about the world. And it's information that somehow it has determined your ego needs to be aware of. And the ego is like a part of the brain that has something to do with conscious experience. And with determining what actions to take. This is very complex. It gets into questions about free will, which are deep philosophical questions that don't have simple answers, and maybe don't have any answers. However, I think that there's a basic kind of game logic that we seem to be able to understand about the world, and that that sort of view of an animal in an environment processing information in order to make decisions that will guarantee its survival. So basically the entire evolutionary picture of nature, which is a view that I believe in the sense that I think that theory fits the available evidence extraordinarily well, and also I kind of like it as a theory. I think it's a beautiful psychedelic idea that nature creates in an autonomous, self-organizational way through many drafts, through many iterations, all of this amazing stuff. To me, that's just like an aspect of nature's creativity that I just don't understand, really, this whole tension between, like, broadly, like, the religious community that believes that God created the universe, and broadly the atheist scientific community that believes it evolved in this natural way. I just don't see how those two things actually have anything to do with each other, though. Am I wrong? I mean, what the fuck do those have to do with each other? It seems to me that both of those could be true, or both of them could be false, or either of them could be true with the other one being false. Like, there's no... neither one of them depends on the other in any way, so I just don't get it. It seems to me that the universe could evolve and there could still be God. And it seems to me that there could be God without evolution, and that we could have no evolution and no God. Any of these options are on the table because of the fundamental phenomenological situation, which is that we are in this weird perceptual game, virtual reality presentation, that we do all our operations inside. So because we do all those operations from within, whatever this thing is, the psyche, we can't make any determinations, really, about what reality is independent of the psyche. That's a real asymptotic idea. You can't ever completely extract it, but you can kind of do very complicated aggregative modeling and sort of experimental testing things that will let you get closer and sort of more and more functional metaphors, fundamentally. Now, I say functional instead of accurate, because we don't know how accurately they map, because we don't know what they're mapping exactly, but we just know that they map in a way that seems to work. We get results that are predictable and that please us, or so on. And so that's more or less what we have with this whole scientific picture. But I like the evolutionary idea, as I already said, for many reasons, but one reason is because it's compatible with that basic scene. The basic scene of you have a perceptual system and information is coming through it, and then you have to make decisions. It's built on that whole thing. So I find it very, like, phenomenologically sound as a natural, or as a theory of the natural world. It fits with what I think I understand about perception and how animals exist in a state of some kind of consciousness, whatever we mean by consciousness. I'm going to have to cut because I did that thing where I got too many tunnels deep in the idea. Now I don't remember the top level nest. 1 second. That's right, of course. It was all in the context of my... I should back up, because very often this thing doesn't record my first... It doesn't record fast enough. I hit record, and it cuts off my first few... things like that. Like, this device just kind of sucks. That needs to be way more responsive and speedy. We're out in the world with these phones trying to capture these little moments. That's very annoying, that there's a delay between when the screen shows me it's recording and when it's actually recording. If there's some terrible technical limitation that just can't be overcome with the, billions upon billions of dollars in resources that this giant company has, then okay, but maybe you could tune it in such a way that it doesn't even give me the visual feedback until it's actually recording. I know you want to have it be snappy from an interface perspective, but that's a bit of a lie, isn't it? It's not actually snappy under the hood. It's just snappy in terms of what it shows me on the screen. The process hasn't begun yet, and now you've created a situation where the interface is lying to me about the state of the internal machine. And that's a very bad design practice. And well, actually, that gets rather back to the point, because all of this was in the context of really of interfaces. Conscious experience is an interface. And your unconscious is everything else that exists, as it were, behind that interface. A big part of it is about producing the interface. And it's the same thing with this phone. A whole lot of the computational resources in this phone goes into rendering the display and processing the touch screen and all this kind of stuff. But that's not the only thing going on in the guts of this phone, obviously. Then it would just be an interface. It couldn't do anything else. So it has all kinds of other things that it can process complex information. It has browsers and email, and it has this whole camera environment. If we're thinking of this phone as a psychological model, or as even a kind of weird, abstracted, robotic, anatomical model, let's say a kind of cybernetic model in the non-technical sense, but in the pop cultural sense of cybernetics as like robots and cool stuff. If we were to think of the phone that way, then I suppose the camera would obviously map onto the optics and the eyeball. It's all, and it really is that way because, of course, this thing is tuned for our senses. So it's a little inverse impression or something of how our psyche works. We have a voice, so this thing has a microphone, but then its microphone is like our ears, because it turns out that if you have a voice, you need ears. You see, it's sort of the way it works. The voice is useless if the other monkeys don't have ears to interpret it, of course. So the two things develop together. These two things exist in a relationship already. And that's something, wrapping back around to this evolutionary concept, is such an interesting idea to me. They were formed in sympathy with each other. And you can predict the other on the basis of just what this one is, this produces vibration in the air. So you need something that can receive those vibrations. And then you need some big complicated system that can process that and make meaning out of that. And so that's what the psyche is. And it seems to be the most basic thing about it is it has kind of two parts that are interacting. And you can probably infer that just on the basis of its raw anatomical structure. It exists in two halves with a bridge in the middle. Now, I'm not saying that the left and right hemisphere track the notion of the conscious and the unconscious, or the ego and the unconscious, strictly speaking. I think it's probably rather more complex than that. And also, the entire situation with brain lateralization is quite complex. We're always using both hemispheres all the time, and it's funny, the idea that there's kind of a creative one and a more like linear intellectual one or something is an idea that is kind of both wrong and right. It's wrong because both hemispheres are involved in very many tasks, and certain things that you might think are more creative or more analytical might be involving both, and etc. But it is true that they seem to be tuned for broadly different things and are more active more of the time in certain kinds of activities than in others. And there's a great book written about this that I've only read kind of the introductory spiel for. I didn't go through the whole part where he goes through the whole history of art and all this amazing stuff, but there's a book called is it The Master and His Emissary? By Ian McGilchrist, I think that's right. And he lays out this whole story about the hemispheres and about how they work. They really are somewhat autonomous. Sometimes people have disorders, like of an epileptic sort or things like that require that the corpus callosum, the bridge between the hemispheres, be cut, because for some reason that seems to resolve some of these issues. So there are people who had it cut, and then there are people who have accidents where it's cut or so on. And those patients, it entrains the eyes, of course, so you can show them an image in one eye, and because the callosum has been severed, they won't see that image consciously, because that whole side is not accessible to their conscious awareness anymore. So you show an image just there, and they don't see it, but then if you ask them to describe the image they're seeing, they'll draw it. They'll draw it even though they don't know what they're drawing. They don't have it consciously, but it will just come out of their hand, the one connected to the other hemisphere, presumably. That's an amazing fact about human beings, and that's probably exactly just what I learned how to do naturally. The automatic drawing thing is like that. It's more or less autonomous. You just let it happen. So you're throwing your hand, because of motoric control systems, to this other thing. Maybe to the right hemisphere, maybe to the unconscious. Who knows what we're going to call this? But it's just other stuff that's not in your ego awareness, though. And so our interface, the interface through which we relate to these other parts of ourselves, is, I don't know to say if this is fortunate or unfortunate, but it's just something that, it's just rather something that requires development, unfortunately. It's not like the iPhone. It's not like you turn it on and there's this beautiful interface and it's all kind of clearly labeled. It's just a big, muddled, strange interior zone of thoughts and feelings and stuff for most people. You really have to spend a lot of time in there to kind of, or at least I did, to start to kind of map these different zones and understand how is a feeling different from a thought? And then subtler things. How is a feeling different from an intuition? How is an intuition different from just a fear or a prejudice? And how are all of those things maybe different from something perhaps even more profound that you might find inside of yourself, more than an intuition, a vision, let's say of a clairvoyant kind, potentially. All of these kinds of things I believe, are existing within the human being and can be related to with enough resolution and fidelity, as it were, to be more or less comprehensible and navigable. And so that's really the thing I would like to say about how to manage interaction with the unconscious in real time. It's just like music. I'm a musician, and I do a lot of kind of music stuff. I sing, I play guitar and bass, I play some keyboards, and I do synthesizer stuff, and audio production and recording and mixing and writing and all that whole stuff. And when it comes to the performance aspects, those are the parts that have to happen in real time. Composition, mixing, production, those are all things that you can work on in a slow, layered, aggregative sort of way. But when it comes down to lay down the bass lick or to just track the vocal, that's something that has to happen in time. Sorry, I was trying to decide if I want to talk about voice or guitar. Let's start with guitar. If you watched like a Guitar God shredding, and when I was a teenager, that was a zone where I could connect to some kind of masculinity that I could identify with a little bit. It's like, okay, these guys are like symbolically wielding a phallus, and they're mastering a kind of athletic technique, but it's all this small, like, and then what flows out is this kind of feminine creative expression thing. And I think the electric guitar in particular, I mean, look at it, it has a feminine shape. It's designed that way, obviously. They're evocative of hips. There's the gnarly bass over there. I love this instrument. I'm just learning it, but wow, it's a whole different thing to guitar, let me tell you. So yeah, it's it was a strange. There's something weirdly androgynous, I would say, about the electric guitar. It is so masculine in a sense, particularly of the kind of a heavy metal kind of variety, like this one maybe with this. So this is a very cheap Washburn guitar, like $70, I think, is what I paid for this. It's maybe the cheapest instrument I've ever owned. This little MIDI keyboard costs significantly more than that, It's actually a really great guitar. Plays really, really well. Plays better than the $200 Ibanez I bought a while back, which is a very cool looking guitar. But couldn't stay in tune, unfortunately. But yeah, so it kind of emits this aggressive tone. Oh gosh, Alan Waller is sending me very, very interesting messages right now, and it's distracting me. Let's see. I can interact with my phone for a second and put it on silent. Incidentally, I have something to say about... it's just too many things to say. I was just trying to say the electric guitar is an interesting androgynous thing, and I connected with it very early. I'm going to invert the camera again. Wait for the iPhone to catch up. So I was really interested in a lot of guitarists. Sorry, I am going to get back to the consciousness and all this. It's just... I want to throw it into a musical metaphor, so to get into the mood, I'm going to talk about music a little bit. I was really into a lot of different kind of guitar music when I was a teenager. I loved, I fell in love with OK Computer and the guitar textures on that record. I fell in love with Tool, and again, it was like a kind of a textural thing for me. I loved the sound, and Adam Jones, the guitarist in that band, was doing such interesting psychedelic and kind of subtle things, very subtle things, like there's a technique on electric guitar called pinch harmonics, and that's about where you place your picking hand. You can essentially... I should actually have my instrument out to explain things like this, but you can kind of lightly touch the string on the guitar, and if you touch it right in the middle of the string and then pluck it, it'll sound a note higher than the root note of the string. And so instead of getting a ba, you'll get a ba sound. This very beautiful kind of whistly tone, and that's called a harmonic. And that happens because you're resonating the string, but you've kind of poked it right in the middle and divided it in half, which is a harmonic interval. So it's a kind of it's a very fascinating property of sound and of the physical world. But because it involves dividing the physical string in half, or in other kind of harmonic ratios, which are harder to hit and require more pressure to sound, actually more like striking pressure on the picking hand. They're in fixed positions along the neck, so there's only so many notes that you can get with that effect, which is very limiting. What if you want to write a melody, and there's one particular note in that melody that you would love to have that texture? You'd love to have that note be this kind of whistly harmonic note. Or if you were distorting it, it'll produce a kind of screechy bird sound, which I love. It turns out you can do that with this technique called pinch harmonics, which will let you produce a harmonic on any note on the fretboard. The way that you do that is with this very subtle technique with your picking hand. That's why it's called a pinch. It doesn't involve anything with the playing hand. That just frets the note as normal. But then the picking hand does this interesting maneuver that I'm not even sure exactly technically how it works, but in any case, it just involves memorizing sort of pick positions and then mastering this very subtle kind of thumb flick thing that sets off the harmonic. Now, when I was in high school, listening to that band, to Tool, and listening to Adam hit these pinch harmonics, like, he plays pretty much an entire melody in pinch, the whole thing is pinch. And furthermore, it's not just on or off. He's mastered it so much that he can get a blend, so he can get like mostly the root and then just a tiny bit of whistle added in. And it's not random. He plays it exactly perfect, and if you listen to him play it live, he follows it usually pretty exactly, and it's like amazing, because it barely sounds like a guitar anymore, and you wonder, gosh, how is he getting this effect? And at the time, being 15, 16, or however old I was, I had no idea. I didn't know what a pinch harmonic was. And the internet existed, but it kind of wasn't in the state that it was today. You couldn't just go on, there wasn't YouTube. So you couldn't just go on YouTube and get a guitar lesson, like look up pinch harmonic and have that explained to you in a nice visual way. I mean, I probably looked it up and probably heard the term, but I had no idea how to produce it. And didn't really understand it. I kind of thought those sections of Lateralis might have been made with some kind of a crazy pedal or something. And that actually is going on as well. He's running like a wah during some of those sequences and stuff. So it's all very, he's getting very complicated and cool sounds out of that instrument. But the point is that that is a technique that is a real technique. And the point is that this guy has spent thousands of hours memorizing in these pick positions so that it becomes autonomous. So when he performs it, he doesn't have to keep track of it consciously. You can't. There's no way to consciously figure out the pick position. The melody is moving too quickly. And that's how it is anyway with anything you're playing with music, You just have to memorize it typically, or you have to have sort of memorized something else that's going to make it happen in real time, like improvisation. But it's the same thing. You don't improvise consciously. What you do is you learn a lot of techniques so that if I want to, I can do a pinch harmonic. If I want to, I can do a palm mute. If I want to, I can do a bend or a slide or a nice vibrato. Maybe I learn various ways of producing vibrato and so on. You learn all these different techniques. And then you also typically learn all these different little sort of fragments, to throw it into like a vocal riff idea. You might notice if you listen to a lot of Michael Jackson records that there are certain things he does all the time. Like one thing he'll do all the time is this kind of dun da dun dun da da. That like ba 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 idea is in so much of his music. Almost becomes rather repetitive. And I don't want to sort of do more Michael impressions at the moment. It's quite early, but there are just various things like that, and so you learn things like that, and it's kind of, what is that? I mean, it's a signature of his, basically. And I think I have some things like that maybe in my musical lexicon. They're just intervallic and rhythmic relationships that, which is to say, just pitch and melody and rhythm relationships that I just find again and again with my voice. There are certain ones that I find. But when I'm improvising, it just happens because I've put in all that work up front. I've learned all those things. I know how to do all those things. A lot of it just lives in my hands. It's completely, I switch off. And that's when it's good. It's really the only time it's good. For me, it doesn't work so much to kind of architect the melody or something. You've got to just let it flow. But in order to get to a place where you can let it flow, you have to develop all this technique, like an athlete. And that is the notion, I think, with our psychological problems as well. We have to develop our techniques for relating to the unconscious so that when situations happen in a real-time way, you will respond out of instinct, which is the only way you can, because consciousness isn't swift enough to make a whole bunch of complicated strategizing and decisions when things are just happening as they happen. Anyway, let me just sort of zoom way out to finally make the point and conclude this now, because I'd like to go eat breakfast. So I'm just going to say that the point of developing musical techniques is so that you can improvise fluidly and not worry about whether or not you're going to be making the correct or incorrect moves. You're just going to trust that the correct moves are going to happen. And if you think that you can pick up a guitar and instantly sound like Adam Jones, or pick any guitar person you might admire, or just any, or transpose this into some example that's more relevant to you, a great chef, or who knows. Of course, I'm keeping this all in the domain of sort of like arts and crafts things or something, but whatever the example is for you, a great military strategist, I don't know what. If you think you can kind of just, or a great stand-up comedian or something, you think you can just jump into those situations and you're just gonna, it just isn't. Even if you're really talented. I consider myself pretty musically gifted, but I still had to learn how to play these instruments. I still had to sit there every day and I started that young. When I started to learn guitar in high school, I was like a guitar-obsessed kid. It's almost like all I did for a while was just play guitar, and I got really good really quickly. However, and this rather tracks, in fact, it was developed on a poor foundation because I didn't have a real teacher. Now, I wouldn't have accepted a real teacher. I was always kind of, I'm going to do it myself. People don't know how to play. They're going to ruin my ability to be creative and blah, blah, blah. I had the predictable kind of bad attitudes about that you have when you're 15 and an artist, and feeling a little dejected already by the world and all of this. So I really got into it and played every day, but was playing in a way that ended up hurting me, actually. And I developed problems in my hands, and I had to go get a little bit of physical therapy for that. I had like tendonitis issues and all this kind of stuff. And hey, guess what? I don't have those problems now, even though I'm playing a ton of music, practicing. Well, actually, recently I've been so distraught I haven't been, but usually I'm practicing every day and all this kind of stuff now. And I don't have any issues so far, and I think it's because I'm playing correctly now. I recently kind of rebuilt my technique in a more correct way. And I did that at the same time that I was rebuilding some psychological techniques in a more correct way. And when you have the techniques correct and they're autonomic, then you can just fly. I mean, you can just soar with it. And so I think it's just the same way with psychology, of course. The solution to how do we relate to ourselves and relate to others in a way that transcends the kind of simple, negative, instinctual forms of interaction is that we all have to put in the work so that when we're dancing, it goes smoothly and we're not, we both know, everyone knows the steps and we're not trampling over each other's feet. And we know what we're doing in a much more direct way, but in a much more autonomous way. So, okay, there's where I'll leave that idea, I guess. I'm going to go make some tea or something and, eat something and get on with my day. See you in the future. Bye.